And I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking something very important, African security issues. My name is Robert Lloyd. I'm Vice President for the Association that Studies Middle East and Africa, ASMEA, which is where we're at. I'm sure we all know that. I'm also Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Palm Beach Atlantic University and Professor of International Relations. So I have a lot of titles, but I'm delighted to hear. And today it's not about me, it's about our presenters who've done a lot of work working on their papers. I've read them all and thoroughly enjoyed each one. We're going to have about 15 minutes for each presenter to present, and then we'll have some Q&A time afterwards. So we're a relatively small group. We're spread out, and I think we should have a good discussion here. All right, so the four discussants we have here, you can see them in your panel discussion, so I don't want to belabor it too much, but Dr. Stephen Childs will be up first. He's papers on private military companies in Sub-Saharan Africa, failure or future. Or a future. Dr. Stephen Childs is an Associate Professor of Political Science at California State University San Bernardino, where he teaches in the National Security Studies Graduate Program. His research and teaching interests cover strategic studies, national security policy, and the regional security and politics of the Middle East and Africa regions. So, Dr. Childs, come on down. We'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Glad you could be here. There we go. Very good, thank you. So my research is on private military companies in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm not an Africanist by training and more of a security guy, but this is an area that's keenly interested me. I look primarily in a lot of my scholarship at security assistance policies, so monies and training that go towards helping bolster the security forces of a government. And lately, the track record hasn't been too impressive on that, regardless of the region. And so this kind of jumped out at me when teaching a seminar as a point of interest. It's just saying, well, are there alternate forms of security provision that kind of make sense? Would they work or would they not so much work? And so PMCs kind of struck me in that regard. First, I want to clarify the point that I think commonly gets missed, not so much in scholarship, but certainly in a lot of the common discussions of the topic, and that is to clearly define what a PMC is, a private military company is, because there's a lot out there hovering and folks aren't always clear. I appreciate Sean McFate's definition. He does a lot of work in this area. He defines them as expeditionary conflict entrepreneurs, structured as multinational corporations that use lethal force or train others to do so. So there's kind of three elements here that we see if we kind of break it down into the who, what, and why. The who, these are non-state entities. They're corporate entities. And importantly, they are not domestic to the context where they're used. That's when they're expeditionary. They're from other areas and are sent to a particular war zone to operate there. They do so for a profit motive. That's the why. So even though they can be employed and are commonly employed by states for political purposes, that's not their interest. Their interest is getting the profit. And I think what's critical, kind of the element of the definition, the second part in terms of what they do is critical, and that's how they fight. They're combat forces. And I think this is where a lot of confusion can happen to distinguish them from, say, private security companies, PSCs. So when we look at PMCs, there's two primary forms, and the part that gets a lot of attention is actually probably the least common in the empirical literature, and that is mercenaries. The idea that forces are engaged in combat and they're done so and paid to do so. It happens, we're going to look at some cases this morning to illustrate that, but it's not really the majority of cases. And most examples of private military companies are actually enterprisers, where they are training other forces to do exactly that. So that's the distinction. What I want to draw the comparison to is that in private security companies, PSCs, and a lot of folks look at them and think, hey, that's what a PMC is, right? Not really. How many of you guys have heard of Blackwater? Okay, probably the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, company. I would argue definitionally they don't really fit the bill of a private military company, that they are more an example of a private security company. And that is because those types of forces are not really geared towards combat. Their main role and vision is not to be a combat force. They can use the force and do use force, but they're not in a war zone to fight and secure objectives, use fire maneuver, acquire territory, the kinds of things that we typically associate with high-intensity combat. Hopefully that makes sense. What do PSCs do? They do a lot of cases of personal protective details, bodyguard actions, convoy protection, protecting infrastructure. So of course they have a need to be equipped to do force, but that's not what their primary job is. They're not going in there to fight. They're going in there to respond to sort of fighting that happens. I hope that makes sense, but please we can clarify it certainly in Q&A if it doesn't. The reason why I went through that is because I want to focus on PMCs. and these are particular groups in Sub-Saharan Africa. My research question, kind of the plausibility probe is, well, would we expect to see more or less use of these types of entities in Sub-Saharan Africa, given prevalent conditions in the international system? And so we might ask, well, why PMCs? Why even consider them at all? And I think there's some important realities just to the African security landscape that bear worth mentioning. And that is, in a political sense, many regimes are marked by kind of a neo-patrimonial form of governance, right? Where, coming from a Western perspective, we think of the state as a public goods provider, but in a lot of contexts, it's actually private goods that matter among leaders who are trying to stay in power. And even though I'm starting off with politics, the translation to security is that in those contexts, you're going to see most likely renewed focus on insurgency because there's a distinct urban-rural divide in many of these instances, right? Folks in the urban areas tend to be focusing resources on their own co-ethnics, those who they need to propel themselves to leadership, and are probably going to be more likely to ignore those in the outlying hinterlands of those governments. And that can provide a strong impetus for insurgency, whether it's out of opportunity, which I'll get to in a moment, or just simple grievance. There could be very real grievances with that. Concurrently, the leaderships are not that interested in creating strong professional military forces for their own government, because that's essentially how you arm your next replacement. If you're more trying to coup-proof your regime, then you're not interested in making an effective, empowered military. And consequently, when these insurgencies do arise, we see this strong capabilities gap, where insurgents, even though they're not perhaps the best equipped, they are strongly motivated, and the professional security forces perform quite poorly. And we see this in the cases that are both autocratic governances as well as democratic governments. We'll look at Nigeria, for instance, as one case study there. And then finally, from the supply side, when it comes to people who can provide security outside of the African context, there's strong allergies, I think, to intervention. Certainly not even in an African context, but certainly because of the long history in the Middle East, there's kind of hesitancy to deploy forces, commit forces to those types of contexts. And that goes back to the 90s and the peacekeeping episodes therein. So, point being, if multinational governments are less likely to intervene, if domestic governments don't have as much of a capability to deal with security threats, does this carve out a niche for PMCs to take a broader role? That's kind of the main question of interest. If we look to the academic theory related to PMC use, some of the proponents argue, look, these are very financially effective means. Not only are they actually cheap for the force that they provide, but they're not impacted by the paralysis that we see of bureaucratic forms. If we're trying to get a multinational effort going, multiple countries contributing troops, you get issues of funding, you get issues of direction, who's actually in charge with command authorities. They're not things that are insurmountable inherently, but they are more difficult. It's more of an uphill battle to be able to succeed in those efforts. And so PMCs, the argument is PMCs promise less bureaucracy and more action. The other thing that PMCs will argue in their own literature is, look, we're a whole single solution. You don't have to go out and contract with one entity to provide logistics, to provide medical evacuation or support, to provide infantry or armor, or even helicopter assets. We bring it all to the table. So you hire us, and we're an easy solution. That can be seen as kind of enticing to governments who are looking for that. And then finally, perhaps one of the strongest ones is this idea that politically they're appealing because they are impermanent security actors in that context. Because they are expeditionary, you can call them in, contract them, and then when you don't want them anymore, you just cut off the funds. That's why they're there in the first place. They're less likely to stick around. Versus if you seek other security measures in a domestic context, for instance, working with certain militias or warlords or whatnot, right? There's all kinds of issues working with those actors, absolutely, but at the same time, they're permanent. They're not going anywhere. Whereas if you're seeking to politically empower yourself, the contractor route might be appealing. And of course, in literature, there's not just all just proponents of this. There's certainly issues that are seen as dangerous regarding PMC use. And chief among those is this idea of recolonization. Saying, look, there's a long history of governments using force to secure resources, of which Sub-Saharan Africa has an abundance. Is this not just a new face of that? Are these PMCs now just the new coercive element to seek resources? After all, they are doing this for a profit motive, and the primary profits seen in these countries, source of profits, are going to be these natural resources, be they natural gas pipelines, routes, or diamonds, you name it. There are additional critiques that this model incentivizes warfare, incentivizes profit. If you make money fighting war, then isn't war good for business? So maybe you're not interested in actually solving the problem. Maybe you're interested in prolonged conflict. Interestingly enough, a lot of the empirical literature, the large N studies, seem to refute that point, interestingly enough, saying that the PMC use tends to be seen with much shorter durations of conflicts, but higher intensity. So a bit more like ripping the Band-Aid off instead of sort of peeling it slowly. And then finally, a major concern is that of international norms. You know, a kind of de facto explanation or definition of the state is that that entity is the sole monopoly on the use of legitimate force, and how with PMCs you're talking about entities that are legitimizing their use of force and yet perhaps have accountability concerns, right? Who are they accountable to? It's the shareholders, right? Not necessarily governments. And so there are certainly issues in terms of performance, in terms of human rights abuses and the like as well, and just broadly speaking, accountability overall. So in my research, I tackled 3 notable cases. And the first I started off with, it's kind of a requirement because it's the common case used to justify a lot of those benefits I showed on the previous slide. Oh, these work because look at executive outcomes in Sierra Leone in 1995. Didn't they do such a great job? And so as a case study, it is kind of interesting because militarily they were very successful. Backstory there is you have a South African commando, Eben Barlow, who kind of recruits from former specialized units in the border wars. In 1992 comes along, the Cold War is effectively over, and he's got these guys with these skill set. It's broader global demilitarization, yet they have skills and they're looking to perhaps use them. And so he creates executive outcomes as one of those early, post-Cold War PMCs, private military companies. And just a few years after they're created in 1992, they're put into action in 1995 in Sierra Leone. And so the Civil War there had started in 1991. By 1995, there's a whole backstory to it that I won't get to, but things escalated to the point that the insurgent groups, Revolutionary United Front, RUF forces, are knocking at the capital of Freetown. They're about 20 miles away. Things are looking quite dire. Perhaps a better tell than just how close they are to Freetown is that by this point in time they had seized the diamond mines in the southwest of the country, which is typically the government's cash crop. They had eastern diamond mines that they had seized, but that was more in their territory. The fact that they take the western mines, they've now cut off the source of income for the government in Freetown, and they're also knocking at the gates of the capital. So there's a very strong imperative to sort of, if you're the Sierra Leone government at the time, Valentin Strasser is president, seized power in a coup, he wants this security problem solved. And so in comes executive outcomes saying, look, we're your solution. By March 1995, they're contracted in to do this. They, again, bring all their own support elements together. I've seen estimates range from 350 to 500 core operatives who are part of this effort. And effectively, they, working with certain counterparts on the ground in Sierra Leone, are able to push RUF well away from Freetown. And in fact, 7 months after the initial intervention, are able to even, in fact, seize RUF strongholds in the center of the country. And in fact, even those eastern mines come under control of the government briefly. So it's a total 180 in terms of the military reality on the ground. Unfortunately, in the long run, we all know, probably well know, that Sierra Leone's civil war did not end in 1995-96. It persisted, and the rationale for that is that the contract had expired, was not renewed, so executive outcomes packs up and moves. There was no security force in the wings to take over, and so the civil war, the RUF and the civil war just persisted. It kind of sprung out again, leading ultimately to UNAMSIL and a UN peacekeeping effort to deal with that. So interestingly enough, military solution in the immediate kind of was that Band-Aid solution, but certainly not a long-term political solution. We'll kind of see this again in our next case, which is a more contemporary example in 2015. This is STTEP, Specialized Tasks, Training, Equipment, and Protection. So a new outfit that's formed, also headed by, you guessed it, Eben Barlow, the same guy that does executive outcomes fame. He becomes the chair in 2009 of STTEP. And at this point in time, in the case of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan's administration is facing some dire straits in late 2015. He's heading into re-election, and Boko Haram's insurgency has just sprung out of the northeast. Certainly by 2014, 2015, they're holding some 20,000 square miles of territory, and they seem unstoppable. Nigeria's military is unable to really put a dent in them or even halt them. And so there's an acute security concern. Just the year prior, the Chibok girls' abduction had taken place. There's lots of international pressure and attention on the case as well. And Goodluck Jonathan, as a politician, he's heading into re-election. He wants a success. So he's approached by Eric Prince of Blackwater fame, who kind of hawks this total solution. He says, you can pay me $1.5 billion and we'll do all of security for Nigeria. Not just the northeast of Boko Haram, but we'll take care of the pipelines and the rest of it. Right? And Goodluck Jonathan rejects that offer. And instead, interestingly enough, he turns to a more homegrown African solution, which is the STTEP firm in South Africa. Hires them for a 3-month contract. 3 months, go after Boko Haram, make the security problem go away, train up a force of the Nigerian military to sort of get the Chibok girls back. That's the effective mandate. And the government literature to this day, Nigerian government insists that they were hired on as enterprisers to fulfill that training role, to train Nigerian forces to fight. A lot of open source reporting, though, indicates fairly soon thereafter that STTP forces were actually operating and engaged in combat, not just training. By the way, this was much to the chagrin of Nigerian military, who were opposed to this option. But good luck, Jonathan. President Jonathan advanced it nonetheless. Similar to the executive outcomes case, the situation on the ground militarily shifts significantly. And Boko Haram militants are pushed well back from a lot of their bases of support all the way to Gwoza, which gets recaptured by government-backed forces. Boko Haram militants then filter into the Sambisa forest. Unfortunately, it's not the last that we see of them. But in terms of the short-term security provision, they seemed to deliver in this instance. However, similar to this executive outcomes case, this wasn't the wholesale solution, right? Interestingly enough, for President Jonathan, he lost re-election. He did not win even after seeing the success of hiring these guys. But after the 3-month contract expired, STTEP leaves, and Boko Haram comes out of Sambisa to have a renewed emphasis. Thank you. Okay. I'll go very briefly over this last case because there's not much to tell. This is interesting because it's a Russian example, which has seen a lot of use in the continent most recently. And so this is the Wagner Group in Mozambique. President Nyusi hires them after a talk with Vladimir Putin. They show up in September of 2019, and they last until November. They lasted 3 months, not because the job was successful and they were able to leave, contract expired. They actually left because they had incurred a fair number of casualties, and they really did not endear themselves that well to their Mozambican military counterparts. Even rudimentary things like language training and interactions just were not happening. Lots of evidence that Wagner militants were engaged heavily in targeting civilians specifically, which made them quite unpopular. And so, interestingly enough, you have this non-African outfit, not from South Africa, hailing from Russia, where they just really had a very club effect. And it's kind of interesting in the Cold War context. It makes some sense because we didn't really see that much in terms of Soviets doing this. It was the Cubans who were doing this on behalf of the Soviets during the Cold War. And perhaps some of the reasons why come about in that instance. To conclude, just basic observations looking at these cases, what might we pretend for the future of PMCs in Sub-Saharan Africa? I'd say there's 2 major structural pushes that might see more use, and then 1 significant detractor to it. So the two positive forces for use, calling for it, would be global international regimes and the global order, however we want to define that, seems to be on the wane. There isn't as much of an emphasis for those more global approaches. I think a better example could be made of the global economy. There's a lot of concern certainly about where that's headed, and that the resources are going to be a lot scarcer, and so PMCs might be seen as a more enticing fiscal option, potentially. The second element would be the return of great power competition. Obviously the U.S. and China are keenly involved in the continent, as is Russia, and so whenever great powers get involved, obviously lots of things happen. It's not out of the ordinary to suggest that PMCs might be used in these sorts of efforts to shore up regimes that governments that the powers want to bolster or to detract from them. Finally, the issue that I think would push against their use is the expertise gap. In our 2 success examples, they effectively were the same outfit of these South African commandos from the 1980s, right, who still have been active, but they're getting up there in age, and so very likely they're going to retire and leave the scene. And I don't know that there's a replacement option in the wings of folks who are combat veterans who bring that expertise that have made their military operations successful. So that's interesting. That'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of will it be as sought after of an option if new forces are used that aren't successful, kind of like Wagner, who don't have the expertise and just don't do that well. Will that sort of detract from their use altogether? Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions later.
We are off to a good start. Our next presenter is Dr. Daisy Muibu, and her paper is on police self-confidence during conflict, examining officers' sense of authority. She is assistant professor at the University of Alabama and a research fellow at Harvard University. Her research is focused on policing and counterinsurgency in conflict-affected states and the role of foreign fighters within insurgency groups. Dr. Muibu received her PhD in justice law and criminology from the American University in Washington, D.C., and her MA in intelligence and international security from King's College, London. So, welcome. Look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you for having me here today. Let's see. Wonderful. So as mentioned, my study is looking at police confidence in their special authority during conflict. What sort of motivated the study was this question about how we can be able to encourage officers to have more normatively desired forms of policing, right? How can we be able to motivate this in an area that is experiencing active conflict? And the reason I'm talking about normatively desired modes of policing, what I'm thinking about is how can officers use their discretion more effectively and more responsibly, and also how they can perhaps engage with the public in a more positive way. So this is generally the question that is sort of driving the heart of the work. And when you think about this question, the motivation at the heart of it is this recognition that a lot of research has been spent trying to understand how we can motivate public confidence. And this came out of this broader realization that motivating public confidence in domestic security sector institutions helps legitimize the state and helps build state stability and state consolidation. And for this reason, you see a lot of research looking at how we can motivate public confidence in areas that are recovering from conflict, or more recently, areas that are still experiencing conflict. But much less work has been focused on looking at officers' evaluations of their own authority, especially how important this is for motivating these normatively desired forms of policing, more responsible use of discretion and more public engagement. Right, and the reason why we need to look at this and why it's so important is that it has been argued, and it's pretty much established, this idea that having officers evaluate their own authority is incredibly important precondition for achieving citizens' confidence in the first place. There's a dialogue that Bottoms and Takembe discuss that occurs between the public and the police. Once the police are able to evaluate their own special authority, this unique place that they've been placed where they have more legitimacy over the use of force, what you find is that if they can be able to exercise their discretion appropriately, engage more positively with the public, that sends a message to the public who then can help build that confidence with the police, and that dialogue is sent back, right? They again provide that confidence to the police, which sort of helps shape how the police see themselves as well. So it's like a back and forth discussion. So a necessary precondition for us to achieve citizens' confidence in the first place is to notice or to recognize how the officers themselves evaluate their own authority. And so the goal of this study was trying to understand how do we even motivate this or what shapes officers' self-evaluations of their own authority. And for this, I looked at the field of criminology, even though Bottoms and Takembe also take a little bit from political science as well as they're sort of developing this work. So one thing that they say that is a strong motivator of officers' evaluations of their own authority is police effectiveness, right? How they evaluate their own effectiveness. Because achieving and maintaining law and order is such a key aspect of the mandate that the police officers have, it makes sense that how they evaluate how they're performing would affect how they see their own authority. The second sort of antecedent that was mentioned is recognition. This idea that officers feel not only recognized but also accepted. And so under this idea of recognition, Bottoms and Takembe came up with this idea of the recognition triad, right? And here it means that you're getting recognition from your supervisor, and so you're looking at how your supervisor sees, whether you think your supervisor cares about your welfare, and this can be your direct station commander, right? The individual that is directly responsible for you within your different post or police station in a conflict zone. How they see you, do they care about your welfare? Do they treat you fairly? There's a little bit of procedural fairness occurring there. This would in fact influence how you view your own authority. Secondly, it's how your own peers view you, right? There's a little bit of an importance about peer recognition in sort of motivating one's confidence in their own authority. And lastly, it's how your clients see you, right? How the citizens view you themselves, right? That conversation we're seeing that happens, that dialogue that happens between the police and the public, that bit is also pretty important. And so I wanted to understand which of these motivators or antecedents seem to matter most in motivating officers' evaluations of their own authority. But to take it even a step further is to see what are the outcomes of that. So the officer feels that they have more confidence in the special authority that they've been placed in, right? That they have this unique place that they've been placed in over society. When how they evaluate their authority, what implications does that have for officers, how they exercise their discretion and behavior. But for me, in this particular study, I was more interested in the second bit, willingness to engage more meaningfully with the community. And this came out of looking at existing work by individuals like Sabrina Karim, Robert Blair, Matthew Naines, who've looked at many different ways we can motivate positive engagement with the community and why this matters so much in areas of protracted conflict, right? Engagement with the community can help make public see the force as more representative, if that's a goal. You can build a representative force, but if they're not interacting with the public, there's no way for them to actually see them as representative, especially if you're operating in a divided society that has experienced protracted conflict. You want to have that engagement. Engagement is also really important for motivating cooperation, reporting, right? It's also really, really important for motivating public willingness to empower the police with even greater discretionary authority. This is especially important to do in conflict zones where we know that there is a plurality of different security actors, both statutory and unstatutory. Why would I then want to empower a force that is a statutory force, right? And so that engagement is really important. And so for this reason, I wanted to look at how officers' evaluations motivate this normatively desired mode of policing, which is engaging with the public. So I looked at data collected in Kismayo in Somalia. So Kismayo was picked because it is a typical case of protracted conflict, experienced over 2 decades of civil conflict, faces an active insurgent terrorist threat presented by Al-Shabaab, and has, had political tensions that has sort of revolved around sort of the development of this very nascent police force that was established in 2016. So the conditions are right to look at this. An area still experiencing protracted conflict, still facing an active threat, and that has a new police force there where we are sort of more interested in sort of building and evaluating its effectiveness as we move forward. So in terms of the data was collected between July and September of 2020. We surveyed 176 police officers. The total population size of the force in 2020 at the time we were collecting was about 544 officers. So these officers were nested in 8 police stations and posts. So it meant sort of varying the time of day, and sort of had to maintain social distancing because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and sort of it was a convenient sample because we had to just survey who was there. But we tried to vary the time of day in which we sort of arrived there so we can catch people coming at different shifts. Also keep in mind, sometimes women wouldn't be manning certain posts at night compared to in the day. So we tried to vary that. And we also conducted all the surveys in Somali language. It's also important for me to mention that though it wasn't a representative sample, what I went ahead and did is look at some of the monitoring and evaluation reporting that was coming out on the police at the time. So as the police force was developed, it was developed using UK FCDO, at that time it was DFID's funding, as well as money from the European Union. And part of that involved monitoring and evaluating very closely the force's development, making sure like clan representation was a very big mandate that was put in place when they were developing the police force. This was through the joint policing program, which later developed into the reestablishing basic police program. So there was different third-party actors involved in sort of monitoring and evaluating the development of the force, trying to see attrition levels and focusing on the numbers. So I managed to get a hand on one of the reports that was being published by one of these organizations, Sahan. And so this is a bit of a survey that they had conducted of 188 officers. Obviously, they had far more, They had far more access than I did. And so I was comparing the numbers of the descriptive numbers across demographic that they collected versus mine. And when you look at it, there is some differences, notably with the clan. When you look at like the Rahanwein, I didn't get that, or the Marahan, Rahanwein they didn't have, and the Marjetin I did. And so you can see sort of there's some differences, but on many of the different variables, they seem to be quite similar. So that sort of gave me a little bit more confidence with the data that was collected. Anyway, I will not take too long in talking about the actual measures. What I'll focus on is sort of highlighting what the outcome, how the outcome was measured and how the outcomes were measured, forgive me. So Confidence in special authority was measured using a single variable, asking, does putting on your uniform make you feel like you have a special kind of authority? And it was binary, yes or no, or I agree or I disagree. And the second question was engagement. So this is direct engagement. In addition to responding to calls for service, do you routinely participate in weekly meetings with community members to listen to their concerns? This was binary as well. For the other explanatory variables, I measured using many different questions. I have the questions in the appendix if you have some questions. Some of the variables had stronger cronback alphas in terms of they made sense to sort of load up together. Others were really low. I thought it was still good to present it here, though I think that's generally a challenge, and it may just make sense to measure using single variables for some, but that's also, I think, one of the critiques of doing this sort of work, and I'd love any feedback anyone has to deal with this. So those are the explanatory variables, sort of those antecedents of predicting officers' confidence in their own authority. And then also controlled for gender, clan identity, and the length of service that they had spent. And length of service was measured here in terms of police phase. What police phase were they recruited in? They were recruited across 3 different phases. In terms of the method, I ran logit regressions with standard errors clustered at the police station level. And let me just dive into the results, which is honestly the fun part. When you're looking at the first bit of findings in terms of what is predicting officers' confidence in their special authority, what you realize is that supervisor recognition has a positive and statistically significant influence. So too, I believe, does the police phase, right, which means when they were recruited. But it seems that supervisor recognition seems to be what is a predictor in this case. In terms of looking at, well, now we know that supervisor recognition seems to matter in predicting officers' confidence in their own special authority. What does special authority then go on to do? Does it then go on to predict officers' willingness to engage more meaningfully with the public, right? And what you see is that it does. Special authority does have a positive and statistically significant influence or relationship with the extent to which officers routinely engage with the public. And so taken together, these results do suggest some level of idea that when we're thinking about the literature on state consolidation and security sector reform or security force assistance or whatever the popular lexicon is to use today, you should focus not just on public and confidence, which is incredibly important, but also sort of the beginning part of this in terms of looking at other aspects like building a force that is more representative, building a force that is more public-facing, but also evaluating how officers are perceiving themselves. Who are the supervisors in overseeing them, and how much confidence do they have in their own officers, and how do they interact? That seems to matter a lot. Of course, this is 176 officers, right? You can imagine if I collected this data across all of Somalia, which would be amazing, right? Would have a larger and probably can see some relationships that perhaps are not coming out here. And so I know other works in other contexts have seen that citizen recognition matters a lot. I can imagine that it would matter here too, but we're just not seeing it, right? Also, there's like limitations, like, for example, I was able to get that access to that Sahan document that was looking at, that sort of looked at the force numbers as a whole, but I didn't manage to get data at the individual police post, police station level, right? So the demographics can be off there. Maybe there were more men and women here. Maybe there were certain clans that were put in certain police posts because they were further away from the city center than not. All of this stuff I couldn't get into. Obviously, it's a non-random sample, so you can only do as much as you can with that. And then there's the obvious questions about how some of these measures perhaps are not as interrelated as the literature would suggest. And, you know, ideally, you'd have a larger N and do a structural equation model and make the necessary modifications, but that just wasn't possible with the data available. Unless anyone has some suggestions, I'm always very open to them. But I think there is really interesting findings here for suggesting a need to also look at how officers evaluate themselves and the implications this has for a whole other things. I can think of people looking at not just public engagement, but other ideas of normatively desired modes of policing. But anyway, that's me. Thank you, and I'll move on.
Thank you, Daisy. All right, our next presenter is Dr. Onek Anyanga, and he will be talking about the Endgame Juba Peace Talks, the Ugandan People's Defense Force, UPDF, and the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, in perspective. He is an associate professor of history at Millersville University of Pennsylvania. His research interests focuses on British imperialism, modern war, revolution, terrorism, and humanitarian crises in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So, we turn it over to you.
Oh, sorry. I got somebody else. I got to get out of here. Wait a minute. Can you help me?
Always good to start with the escape button.
Oh, I've been using Mac, so I have to transition now and the controls kind of. Yeah.
Let's see if is it down here. Okay.
This is mine here.
Okay.
Oh, this the end game is here. The end game is here. Yes.
Let's see if that works.
Yeah.
Oops, I stole your thunder there.
That's okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very, very much, and it's a pleasure being here. I started off my research work looking at conflicts generally across Africa, and what I've realized is that it's very easy to start a war. One of the challenges is how do we really end a war that has been started? And then I did a scan of Africa. And the LRA being my case study, and I've been looking at many other conflicts before, I got to the realization that, in fact, we need to understand and attempt to resolve a problem that had been intractable in Uganda for the last 20 years. And this is the conflict between the Lord's Resistance Army versus the Ugandan government. And as I went further in my investigation, I found that in many of the conflicts across Africa that had been ended through peace talks, there were a lot of dynamics to it. And I also discovered that in many of the conflicts in Africa, there had been either the positive influence of patrons, whether Western patrons or African regional patrons, that wanted peace. And they made sure that the governments in place or the combatants adhere to the terms of the peace talks. So reflecting on the LRA, I went further to try to find why, beyond the literature, that the peace talks that would be held in Juba would fail. And that took me then to the question of looking at when and actually asking myself, let me see if I can make it full page. Oh, okay. Asking myself the question of, if the peace talk begins July, in about a year or so, the peace talk will be teetering to an end and eventually it'll fail. And so I went about talking to a lot of people, and many of those people that have been there and the literature that I've read kind of suggest the following. That, first of all, the LRA negotiation teams, many that had come from overseas, were not directly representative of the interests of the LRA. For the most part, they're diaspora. And for the most part, therefore, many did not have the confidence of the LRA chief, Joseph Kony. I also looked at others that said that the LRA did not trust, understand, that did not trust the very teams that were negotiating on its behalf. And they're saying, well, these guys are opportunists. They were there they didn't enjoy the confidence of the LRA chief, and in actual fact, they were just there to either make a name, because most of the peace teams that went there were being paid. Some argue that, well, these are unemployed diaspora groups that simply went there to make a quick buck. So what do you expect? In fact, this was bound to fail. Some of them would equally say that the LRA were not interested in peace. That, well, you know, the LRA had been hard-pressed militarily, and so peace talk became a mechanism, at least to have a breather, find time, relax, regroup, reorganize, and re-engage. And in looking at all these, others will say, well, you know, the government had very good faith, because what the government did was ensure that they negotiated to the last moment. However, the LRA chief could not sign the final peace agreement. But we need to understand that even the government itself did not sign the peace agreement. So at the end of the day, if both parties did not sign the peace agreement, does it make sense that we should pick on one and see the only one, the LRA, as groups that had not really signed the peace talks when the other had not? So what I did was to ask myself the question, really, why did the Juba peace talk fail? I had to go back to the drawing board, to go beyond the narratives that has already been in place, to try to figure out for myself how I can, from the myriads, what I could call the noise, might offend somebody, but just to say, of the various perspectives out there, how can I try to figure out precisely why? And in view of the many peace talks that have been had in Africa, what is so unique that is not being covered in the case of the LRA? So I talked to a lot of people. I went and talked to those who had been actually at Juba, particularly diaspora groups that I can find in London, so please if you fall consider them. I also had the opportunity to talk to some of the people in Uganda who had been at the peace talks, to ask them really what the serious questions of the failure of the peace talk was. What were the critical components? And how do they, in their estimation of this problem, come to grips with the failure of the peace talk, and we could say in the final analysis, the LRA shifting to destabilize the DRC and Central African republics. So within that context then, key themes that came out was that we need to understand patron-client and proxy dynamics. And so I went back to try to, in Uganda, understand what were these dynamics and what are the implications of these dynamics in terms of ending a war. Remember, we're looking at asymmetric war, we're looking at insurgency, counterinsurgency, we're looking at irregular war, whichever way that we put it, guerrilla warfare, whichever way we put it, which tends to be protracted and over a long span. So in this case then, I found, looking at the case of Uganda, that one needs to understand what had happened in the overthrow of Idi Amin, who were the patrons. And I begin from that point because about 1971, that is when clearly the notion of patrons, proxies, became entrenched in Ugandan politics. And then I looked at the United States and its role, and how has this been pivotal in understanding some of these crises. Later on, I would turn and look at international human rights organizations, for example, Amnesty International. I'll also look at Human Rights Watch, and probably let me just say this about this here, because it might not be very relevant in terms of patrons and proxies. Let me fast forward a little bit to contextualize this. Down the line during the peace talks, when President Museveni for once would say, if need be, I will withdraw the referral to the ICC and then have a settlement back home so that we could resolve this problem. In fact, opposition came from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and then eventually we can slot in the ICC. So they would, in a way, if we understand patrons as countries, this would be organizations, international human rights groups, and then, of course, organizations, legal organizations as the ICC. So let's kick off our understanding. In 1971, Idi Amin would come to power, and the patron of Idi Amin coming to power was Britain. A lot of the declassified materials that we have at hand now clearly links Britain, and has been declassified about 10 years ago, clearly links Britain in the overthrow of the elected government. And Britain, for a while, had Idi Amin. Idi Amin eventually, as a proxy, begins to operate on his own, fell out of favor. He accidentally, whether you say accidentally or stupidly, if I could use this word, invaded Tanzania. And from that point onwards, we have Tanzania becoming the patrons of the Kikosi Maalum. These were exiles that would be very pivotal, including Museveni, in the overthrow of Idi Amin. So we entered this phase, and this phase will not leave us. So as we go along here, we realize that once these leaders come to power, we're going to have a national election. And our national election, in which Museveni would claim that the election was rigged. And in fact, we need to understand that Museveni himself was defeated in his own constituency by his brother-in-law, who is a DP candidate, not the UPC that he claimed rigged the elections. And he actually only offered few positions, electoral members, that would stand, and many of them will lose. But that's a discussion for another point. So Museveni begins a guerrilla war. Now, this is something important for us. By beginning a guerrilla war, Museveni would come under the patron of Muammar Gaddafi. And this is important because as Museveni shifts to become under Muammar Gaddafi will be very pivotal in the first peace talks that will be held in Nairobi. Because from accounts we do have now, one of the commanders will say, well, Gaddafi said, you cannot reach an agreement in Nairobi. The battle line that we have had divided among various rebel factions will collapse, and it did. So Museveni comes to power. So by Museveni coming to power here then, we get to see a number of things. Gaddafi would have a problem with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan bombs Benghazi. By the time Ronald Reagan bombs Benghazi, Museveni's key military officials were actually there. We know this because they wrote about it. We know this because many of them talked about it, that when Benghazi was being bombed, they were in Benghazi Military Academy. So that said then, Museveni later on gets very scared of Gaddafi, strikes a relationship with Ronald Reagan. So he becomes a proxy of the United States. And it would be very terrified. We know this because of WikiLeaks. He's asking the United States to protect his plane as it flies over the Libyan soil. And he said, no, we can't do this. And this is clearly documented. So in the end, regional politics, we need to understand Museveni now is in the ambit of the US as a client. Regional politics happens that Osama bin Laden goes to the Sudan. From the Sudan, Osama bin Laden goes to Afghanistan. And Museveni positions himself as a supporter of the SPLA. Now, the United States, working against the Islamic State under Omar al-Bashir, and Museveni as the regional proxy would back SPLA, and in return, Omar al-Bashir backs the LRA. So now we have international proxies. We could kind of trick it down to regional proxies where Museveni will have an international backer. Omar al-Bashir will be trying to find an international proxy, rather patron, to help him. And it is within this that we get into the Juba peace negotiations. So as the Juba peace talk opens, Museveni had effectively become a client of the United States under the various administrations. And here is where then we find that at the peace talks itself, as it unfolds in Juba, Museveni in the end realizes that it's very difficult for him. So he approaches ICC. And by approaching the ICC, ICC issues an indictment. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. ICC issues an indictment. And Museveni would respond by saying, I'm sorry, you cannot arrest the leader. I will make sure that I withdraw my charge. You cannot withdraw it. That is when Amnesty International comes in. That's when the ICC comes in to oppose, the idea that it would withdraw that charge against the LRA. So within that now, Omar al-Bashir decided to drop the LRA. The LRA without a proxy would not be in any position to challenge the Ugandan government. And as a result of that, the LRA realizes very quickly, if we leave without a proxy, if we sign this treaty, according to some of the people I spoke to, without a proxy that can guarantee us, we're simply taking our neck to the chopping block. Because there's nobody here who could stand behind us and guarantee our survival, just like it's been done in many of the other African conflicts. So within this then, we find here that the interplay of patrons, clients, in the crisis in Africa is vital. The understanding is vital in terms of ending many of the intractable conflicts that ravage our continent. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Lindsay, I'll leave this and then I'll just bring it down and then you can. All right, a few technical issues there. Thank you very much. Our last presenter, but certainly not least, is Dr. Lindsay Scorgie. She's an associate professor of political science at Huron College at the University of Western Ontario. Her paper will be Localized Borderland Rebellion or Global Jihadist Groups. So welcome.
All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. So my paper is looking at a rebel group known as the Allied Democratic Forces that operate in the Uganda-Congo borderland, or commonly just known as the ADF. They've proven to be an extremely resilient rebel group. They've survived longer than nearly any other rebel group in the area, especially in the eastern DRC area. They've come under increased scrutiny from regional governments and global conflict management actors like the UN Peacekeeping Force recently, mainly due to their alleged Islamic State connections and connections to other international terrorist groups. But what I've really sort of focused on is that there's a serious lack of informed discussion on this rebellion and very little understanding of the actual structures and constitution of the group. So what I'm really interested in looking at here are perceptions of the ADF, and in particular this very popular belief that they are first and foremost a global Islamist terrorist actor aligned with other so-called like-minded groups, specifically the Islamic State. Prior to this, it was Al-Qaeda, but this is their alleged connections to the Islamic State have really taken the interest in this group to a new level. But this is a group whose cause really emanates from the local environment, and they have a very deeply embedded position in local cross-border histories, which has really fueled their resiliency over the last several decades. But like a lot of other non-state actors throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, looking for a boost, whether that's a financial boost or political boost, they realized that sort of adopting, the global jihad agenda has been a really convenient and easy label for them. And what we found is that analysts and especially government actors, particularly in the region, have been very eager to sort of jump on this bandwagon of global jihad. So just a little bit of a brief introduction to the group. They go back to the mid-1990s. They've operated in this very remote region known as the Rwenzori Borderlands, which is really just like eastern Congo, western Uganda borderland area. They've been very isolated for most of their existence. They've received very little attention throughout the years until recently. And I think because of this, because of the fact that for about 2 decades they have not been paid attention to very much, we don't know a lot about them. And their composition also tends to confuse outsiders. So their membership includes Ugandan, Congolese, and other African nationals. They identify as Islamic, but various factions within the group do not. So the group is very sort of divided amongst their different camps in the Beni region where they mostly are in operation. Some of these camps are far more Islamist leaning than others. Some of the segments of the group go back generations in the Rwenzori borderland. And what we found is that the ADF in general is very skilled at blending into the surrounding population. They maintain very inaccessible bases and they use very minimal propaganda. And they've also had very few defectors, which has also contributed to us just not knowing a lot about them. They tend to move across the border region with ease. They're very skilled at it, and they have been able to rebound continually for about 3 decades now after military confrontations with not only other rebels, but with the Ugandan army, so the UPDF, the United Nations peacekeeping force known as MONUSCO, and then as well the Congolese army, FARDC. So today they represent probably the oldest rebellion in the area, but also one of the most powerful. They're one of the most well-trained and equipped, and they've also proven now to be one of the most deadly in eastern Congo. And yet, despite their lethality and their incredibly violent nature, there's this huge chasm between the sort of the reality on the ground versus the way that we're hearing about the ADF talked in the media. So what I want to do first is sort of just look at this narrative of the ISIS-ADF connection. So the connection between the ADF and ISIS goes back to 2019. And this is when ISIS first announced that it had operations in the Congo. So via its news and propaganda channel, it claimed responsibility for a series of deadly attacks in the area. And immediately what we saw was that local, regional, and even international media sources picked up on these developments. And this, we have to remember, was at a time when ISIS was, really retreating on, the global scene. And so the fact that it seemed to be now active in this area did spark a lot of interest. Shortly after these attacks, the then ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi officially recognized the ADF and their territory as an ISIS province. He named it the Central Africa Province of the Caliphate. The ADF were supposedly renamed. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name, but they supposedly adopted a new acronym, MTM. And ISIS began to cultivate the image of an extremely active ISIS province in this area. There also began to appear, and this is relatively new for the ADF, but there began to appear a lot of propaganda videos featuring religious instruction amongst the group. Members appeared to be dressing more visibly in Islamic attire. And we also began to see this MTM logo much more sort of pronounced. So to many observers, what started happening in April 2019 and then subsequent developments appeared to really validate earlier claims that the ADF were not only primarily a jihadist-oriented organization, but that they had always been strongly allied to other Islamist forces. And these claims go back over a decade and a half. We've always seen supposed claims of the ADF being allied with other groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Hezbollah, Boko Haram. But the suggestions that ADF was now, that there was now this ISIS connection has generated a level of interest that we just hadn't seen before. So I think there's a lot of reasons, though, to really doubt this narrative that we're hearing so prominently. And one of the first reasons is just some sort of very practical factors about the reality of this connection. So one of the main things is that we see a lot of errors and discrepancies between what is actually happening on the ground as reported by civilians and other, human rights watchers on the ground versus ISIS statements and, their propaganda. So one of their biggest attacks was in January 2020. It was against FARDC, the Congolese army. ISIS claimed responsibility. And then they went on to claim, a huge number of casualties, and that the location had been a really strategic town known as Erengeti in the area. In actual fact, there had not been casualties. The violence actually had occurred around 10 miles south of there. So and this isn't, a one-off event. This is pretty typical of, a very serious disconnect between what ISIS is claiming and what we know to be happening on the ground. There also appears to be internal division within the ADF over what kind of loyalty should actually be being shown to ISIS. There's at least one faction, and a pretty prominent faction within the ADF, that has resisted the ISIS allegiance, and they've remained more loyal to sort of the original vision of the group, which was much more centered on Ugandan politics. I think the other, and sort of, I would say this is the most prominent reason we should be doubtful of this, is that the UN group of experts on the Congo has yet to this date, yet to find any direct link between the groups. So they've yet to be able to confirm any direct command and control of ISIS over the ADF. And they've still never found any actual evidence of a transfer of any kind of resources, whether that's financial, equipment, military, etc. Also, one other factor to just sort of add in is that the ADF itself has not changed that much since its supposed allegiance to ISIS. So we haven't really seen a change to their structure or their sort of modus operandi since the apparent affiliation began. There's also some more what I call sort of theoretical reasons to doubt this connection. And I think we have to remember that allegiances of this kind, they have to bring benefits to both parties. But there's very little evidence of this kind of symbiotic relationship taking place. One thing to remember is that only about 3% of the population, of the local population in this area, are Muslim. And of that population, radicalism is almost non-existent. So there's very little chance of Sharia law or a global jihadist agenda actually gaining traction on the ground in this region. Related to that is that the ADF seems to have no qualms themselves about allying with other non-Muslim groups. And in fact, most of the groups that they sort of strategically ally themselves with at one time or another are overwhelmingly Christian. And also the population on the ground, they are politically and culturally of a tradition where, they would vastly differ from, sort of foreign fighters that an alliance with ISIS would presumably involve. And given that the ADF is so dependent on their integration in this local area for their, socioeconomic existence, it's really unlikely that they would risk the kind of alienation that would come from inviting a global jihadist group into the area. It would also, of course, attract a lot more attention from their enemies, like the UPDF. Furthermore, just sort of practically, the ADF is much more focused on targeting the near enemy. So really any group that threatens their sort of stronghold in that area and that would threaten their lifelines, whether that's economic or military. So they're focused on, making sure that they claim that area of land and the resources in that land. And so their enemies are the UPDF, the Congolese army, MONUSCO, anyone who sort of threatens that. Their offensive behavior tends to be very transactional, practical in nature, not ideological or religious in character. So I would say they're overwhelmingly a strategic actor, and that their overriding concerns are maintaining the space in this area of North Kivu and everything that entails. And then just a few strategic reasons, finally, to question this narrative as well. We have to remember that the states in the region have some very, prominent motivating factors as to why they might like to, sort of play up this narrative. So states like Uganda and Congo, they've greatly shaped the discourse around the group, and they've tended to really frame it according to their own priorities rather than actual factual analysis. Uganda for a long time has been very interested and very successful in aligning itself with the U.S. and other Western sort of anti-terrorist agendas, and its motives vary for doing that, but really at the forefront has always been in this funding-related agenda. So Museveni has, for years, consistently used the terrorist descriptor when discussing the ADF. He's always been, for the past decade or so, he's been prone to exaggerating the jihadi threat that comes from them. And this has really allowed him to tap into the international discourse and resources of the war on terror. He's also, Museveni has also very commonly been pinning domestic issues on the ADF. And a lot of this is to really sort of help to deflect, criticism related to the country's own poor human rights record. Also its substantial defense budget and demands from outsiders for democratic change. So scholars like Fisher and Whitaker, they've done a great job of really pointing out how successful the Museveni regime has been in securing substantial amounts of foreign aid without the usual strings attached for reform. And a lot of this has to do with his, Museveni's very clear signal that he is a player and partner in the, war on terror more generally. Unfortunately, the main actor who has the power to really correct this framing is MONUSCO, the peacekeeping organization, UN peacekeeping force there, but it has really been plagued with very severe inabilities to properly collect, analyze, and act upon high-quality intelligence. So it hasn't really been able to counter these narratives coming out of, region or countries in the region. So just to conclude, really, there's this very entrenched disconnect between ideas and conceptions of the ADF on the one hand versus the reality of the group on the ground. We've seen numerous actors really choose to understand the group through this very decontextualized lens of global terrorism, failing to look into their interaction and marginalized sort of identity on the ground there in the Rwenzori borderland space. And so I think it's really not any surprise that after over 25 years of existence, the ADF's political ties, social ties, economic ties to that region are essentially still untouched. And what we're seeing now, and sort of the direction I want to go, is how this affects conflict management strategies. Because really, if you're taking this narrative at face value, it's a very different kind of approach to resolving this conflict than if you're understanding the ADF as a group that is really embedded in this area. So I'll leave it at that.